we confess to fraud and to forgery. We're guilty of coldness and spite.
The company is 6 people, me as artistic director, and 5 performers. That's Richard Loden, Robin Arthur, Cathy Naden, Claire Marshall and Terry O'Connor. We've been working together in Sheffield, in the north of England, since 1984, so it's 32 years. This is year 32 of the company's collaboration. Everything we do is very much a kind of group process. It's a very collaborative structure, and everybody inputs into projects on every level. The projects themselves vary a great deal. There are, let's say, more large-scale, more spectacular pieces with invited guests, maybe 10, maybe 12, maybe 15 performers. And those pieces tend to play with, I suppose, the conventions of the theatrical and the spectacular and these sort of expanded ways of thinking about what theatre might be. And at the same time, we have another strand of work, if you like, at the other end of the spectrum, which is very intimate, which might be a smaller number of performers, which might be very much focused on text rather than on doing, on action. And those smaller pieces work more intimately, and they explore a little bit more this sort of minimalist code in terms of getting the audience to work with, let's say, relatively little information and visual excitement, probably a lot from language.
We say, people are cruel. They like to kill. It's the war that has taught them that.
They've kind of changed everything, really. They've changed everything, I think, for several generations of artists. And I don't just mean theatre makers, I mean artists who are sort of working across from visual arts to the edges of theatre, to dance, and to sort of artists working with sort of digital cultures. They've changed the sort of possibilities of what a vocabulary of theatre can be, what a theatre space can become, what the experience of theatre is, what kind of stories are being told, who's telling them, how they're telling them. And they've just constantly sort of refreshed themselves. And I think that's been inspirational, as I say, for sort of several generations of artists and makers, but also several generations of audiences, really, who want a different kind of cultural experience, want a different kind of theatrical experience. They don't act, and they don't perform plays, and they don't pretend they're somebody else in somewhere else. They kind of perform real ideas in real time.
If I look back over my theatrical memory bank, it's just peppered with moment after moment after moment. Even with the shows when I'd sit there and for half of it I'd be going, "Oh guys, give me a break," and then something would come out of it that you just go, "That's extraordinary." It seems in its essence it's about failure at first, and then from that arises a kind of glorious poetry of humanity and truth.
Don't look at me. Don't look at me.
For me, forced entertainment have been a reminder, a constant reminder, that the way that we make work in the mainstream is only one very narrow way of making work.
I want you to look at me when I'm lying down.
It's challenging. It's always provocative. You think you're an artist, and this is how we may work. How do you may work? How much are you prepared to have a real proper conversation with your audience?
In a moment, I'm going to lie down. And when I do, you're going to be overwhelmed. You're going to start to cry. You're going to start to cry, and you won't be able to stop for the rest of the show. You're going to cry right to the end. And you're going to cry.
You're going, Kath, it's really working.
They are unique, and I don't use that word lightly. And I think it's partly about their itinerant way of working, their way of moving from a sort of large-scale stage piece on 1 minute to a sort of two-hander, site-specific durational work on the other. You can't sort of pin them down. You never know what they're going to do next, and that means that they're kind of constantly exciting and constantly exciting sort of new audiences.
What was grief like before television?
More private.
What is grief like?
It's like a hole. That you keep throwing stuff into. You know, like a hole that you're trying to fill with something, but it doesn't get filled.
We've also developed a whole series of very long performances, which we're quite known for. I think our influences as a group of theatre makers have been very diverse. So, of course, we've taken influence from theatre. Most of us trained in theatre. We were always interested in music culture, in cinema, in visual art, in literature, in all sorts of other forms. And in a strange way, I would say we've drawn probably more on performative forms like cabaret or vaudeville or stand-up comedy, or we've drawn on things like bad television or movies or other kinds of cultural forms in order to make the work that we make, as well as on theatre itself.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm getting something. I'm picking something up. Yes, there is a very great sense of loss in the house tonight. Somebody here has lost something. A key, maybe. Or a dog. A dog? Yes. Oh, yes. I too feel great loss in the house tonight. I feel loss of a more personal nature. I fear that somebody here has recently lost a mother. Or a brother, a distant relative. Perhaps somebody read about a death in the newspaper.
I first came across Forced Entertainment in New York. I'd been living there for a few years and was working in the PS 122 building. And I went along the corridor one evening to see this selection of new British work about which I was secretly unenthusiastic. and I saw this company that had understood everything that I loved about New York Downtown Theatre and somehow made it about the Britain that I'd left behind. And I was completely overwhelmed. They understand internationally the field that they're in. They understand the languages that people have been playing with, and they've pushed those languages so much further themselves. And I feel as though they exist as dynamic provocateurs within the world of international performance, and performance in the wider sense that could include, all the great visual arts who think about performance and performativity, all the great choreographers feel like they're in a conversation with Forced Dance, and Forced Dance feel like they're having that conversation actively. And yet somehow, certainly for me as someone who's from Britain, they relate it to this place, and very few people do that. Very few people can relate that international artistic conversation as specifically as they do to the forgotten streets and daily lives of a world that's very familiar to me. That they've managed to have this really vibrant identity as a group. Even while the artistic director has had a strong identity of his own, it feels like they're a group that manages to incorporate him with all of his sense of artistic vision within them. But each of the members of the group has their own aesthetic almost, particularly around how they perform. Those people don't perform in the same way on stage. They all do it differently, and yet there's an understanding of what it is to be a real person on a stage, not an actor playing somebody else. To be a real person on a stage and perform, and therefore they do it with their own realness, and therefore they do it differently.
Or in the future, ethical discussions about whether animals have rights or how much animals have rights, well, they'll lead to a kind of re-evaluation of human rights, because it will be asserted that rights are to do with intelligence, and people will start to say, well, if rights are to do with intelligence, then maybe human rights should be linked to intelligence too.
And the goal, I think, is to open a conversation with audiences, to try to find a way to contact audiences, to talk about the experience that we have now, the issues and the questions and the experiences that we think are important. We've always felt that in order to do that, we're going to need a new theatrical language. We're going to need to break the rules of the form, not for the sake of it, but actually because by breaking the rules, by testing the limits of that space, we can turn it into a space that's really able to work for us as a space in which we can articulate the things that matter for us, and to make connections with the audience, and to really make something that speaks into the times that we're living in. The work can be challenging. It can be provocative, it can be difficult, but I think the other thing it usually is funny, and we love the combination of those things, that something can be quite troubling or quite pushy, and then 10 minutes later hilarious or funny and comical. And I think this dance between problem and no problem, or between the comical and the tragic, or the sort of painful and the provocative and the light, the superficial, the throwaway. This kind of dance between these kinds of textures is, again, really close to the heart of the work.
Following the success of our casual Friday dress code, we tried to introduce a Naked Tuesday. But the other staff members didn't play ball.
We couldn't act. There was nothing inside to come out.
When they made a list of what was wrong with England, our names were near the top.